Well, welcome then to this tutorial about Schematron. Welcome back. Schematron is, as Peter said, is a validation language for XML. You can validate XML documents like you can validate XML documents with schemas, DTDs, or relaxing schemas. However, Schematron can go a lot further than just what the classic validation language can do, and I will tell you more about that later. So in the next few hours, 2 hours, I think, some roughly, I will try to teach you the basics of Schematron, and we'll start right at the beginning, right at level 0. So I'm assuming you have never done any Schematron, or only have done some Schematron but doesn't really know how it works. So we'll just start at the beginning. I would also very much like this tutorial to be interactive. So if you have any question, remark, or things are unclear to you, please raise your hand here in the room or on Zoom, shout on the chat or whatever. And then there's Dan there that is keeping eye on everything, and he will interrupt me when there's a question online. All right, so let's start. Short about me, I'm a self-employed XML specialist and content engineer. It still says Groningen. I moved, but that doesn't matter. I'm also the author of a Schematron book, which is recently done as well. I had 2 copies with me, but I already sold them. But if you need access to the book, you can buy it on Amazon. In the end of my tutorial, there will be a slide where with more information about that. So, how are we going to proceed today? The format is very easy, and it's a repeat. So we're going to do a little bit of theory. I'm going to tell you something about the language or a feature of the language, and then we're going to exercise. And the basic instructions for that are on that address there, and you can download, or what I would urge you to do is download the presentation and the code and all the instructions from the GitHub repository connected to that website. The easiest way, really the easiest way to follow along with the exercises is use Oxygen, because there's an Oxygen project all prepared with the presentation, and that makes life a lot easier. And it's not, and that is because Oxygen is, as far as I know, the only integrated development environment that integrates Schematron, so that you can run Schematron from inside your editor, which is just the easiest. If you don't want to do that, there are some instructions about running it on the command line, but then you're a bit on your own, because I can't help you. I can't help you very well with that. So let me just check how many people here in the room are going to follow along using Oxygen. All right, quite a few. Good. Every exercise contains an instructions.pdf file with the instructions for what you need to do. And there is also a solution folder in most of the exercises. There you can look at what at the solution I came up with, which, of course, as Pearl said, there's more than one way to do it. There's also more than one way to do it in Schematron. And there's a syllabus.pdf also on your in the files, which contains all the instructions and all the explanations combined, but it's up to you what you want to use. For the tutorials, you need a little bit of XPath knowledge. So you need to do things with starts with, or contains, or simple string functions. I hope that's not a problem. If it's a problem, just take a peek at what's in the solution folder, and you can find the right syntax for the functions you want. I want you to use. So let's talk about Schematron from a helicopter, from a high-level overview first. Schematron is, to start with, it's a formal XML-based language, so which means that the Schematron schema is a well-formed XML file. It's a simple language, but it's very powerful. It's so simple that I can teach you the basics within this tutorial, which is not very long. And it can do the things that the classic schema languages can do, but it can also go way beyond that. You can actually, it's actually meant for validating things like business rules. So is this date so many days behind that date? Is the sum of all these numbers greater than, less than, that, whatever? Things that you want to check, but you can't easily do in schemas, DTDs, or relaxing. And there are two types of rules, of things you can do in Schematron. First, you have assertions. So you can just assert, is this correct in my XML file? And if not, it will issue a message. And you have reports, which you want to tell the user that something peculiar, interesting, wonderful, whatever is happening in your XML file. So it's not an error, it's a report. And one of the, I think, the most important highlight of Schematron is that it has no built-in messages. So whatever you want to assert or report, you must write your own message, which means that you can make it as user-friendly or unfriendly as you want to do it. And if you use schemas, DTDs, or relaxing, you're up to the processor implementer what kind of message you get. But in Schematron, it's completely under your control. And you can dress up your message with data from the document or whatever. And I'll tell you all about that. Expressions are XPath based, so you do everything you test do in XPath. And you can incorporate XSLT functions, or if you have really complex stuff to test or to check. And you can also incorporate XSLT keys. So if you want to do, which is very useful for things like ID checking. If your file is big and you want to check things against identifiers or whatever, then XSLT keys very much with speeding up your validation process. And if time allows, we'll get to that. And also another highlight of Schematron is that it has a predefined output format called SVRL. I'll show you a bit of SVRL later. SVRL stands for Schematron Validation Reporting Language. It's an XML format which just tells you what the Schematron processor did. And that's very useful because you can use your XML, you can use it in a tool chain, for instance, to create a custom report. So you're not bound to how the Schematron processor throws it at you in a normal way. Now in Oxygen, you won't see the SVRL, but if you use the raw processor from the command line, you will. And for instance, if you do it in a pipeline, like an XPath pipeline, you can take the SVRL and process it further. And about this little rabbit, as Peter called it, it's called the Schematron. And it's somebody told me it's a crossover from two cartoon figures that I never heard about. But anyway, this is the Schematron. It's the Schematron's mascot. And it will be on every slide, so you'll get used to it. And and as Peter said, there are stickers outside the room if you want it on your laptop or on your children's door or whatever. All right, so let's put the Schematron in context. Where do you usually use a Schematron schema? If you want to validate an XML document, the first thing you do is assert whether it's well formed. If it's not well formed, if an angle bracket is missing or a closing tag is missing, nothing will happen because your Schematron, your XML reader will not be able to process it. So nothing will happen. Then usually you validate against a more classic kind of schema, like a W3C schema, a DTD, or a RelaxNG schema. And if that's all okay, your XML file will be called valid. That's an official term. After that, which is not often done, but that's where Schematron comes in, maybe you would like to check the business rules, the more complex things you want to check about your document. Maybe you even want to cross-reference the contents of your document against the database or against another XML document. That's all the things that you can also always do that with Schematron. So then Schematron runs in and you run it against a Schematron schema. And there's no official term for what the document is called then, but let's call that Schematron valid. Then if you've set up your Schematron okay, then you really have a valid document. In practice, things are not so clear because you can sometimes check things that you would usually do in Schematron in Schema, especially with the 1.1 version. You can also do some things you can check in Schema in Schematron. But so it's a bit of a gray area in between those. But this is usually the setup you're talking about. Okay, so to start with, I would like you to see whether all installations are correct and stuff like that. So this is a pre-flight check. If you have downloaded everything, and I hope you have, then would you please open in Oxygen the Oxygen project, where the path is on the slide. And it's not open a file, it's open a project. So use the project menu in Oxygen to open this file. Okay. Anybody having difficulties? No? Okay. If you have done that and you're in Oxygen, then open the exercise 0101 input.xml file. And let me do that too. It should look like this. And because the project file is, I predefined some links between schemas and files, it will already validate, because you see a little squiggly red line around the last article. And if you then validate it, which is there is usually a button here, then you actually get an error message, a validation message at the bottom of your screen. Everybody got that working? Yeah, good. And if you want to have a sneak peek on how a Schematron schema looks, then you can open the schema.sch file. And of course, I'm going to tell you what this all means. All right. So far, so good. So let's start with the fundamentals of Schematron. As I said, Schematron is the basics of Schematron is simple. So the fundamentals are relatively simple to master, and that's a good thing. Okay, let's start with what is an empty Schematron schema, and it looks like this. And this Schematron schema does absolutely nothing. It validates nothing. There are no rules. There's nothing. But this is a valid Schematron schema. And let's take some highlights from it. First, of course, root element name is called schema, which is, and I'm not very happy with that, the same root element as a W3C schema. So it could get confusing if you mix them up. Then there's a namespace, which is fine. It's different from the W3C schema. So which means that this file stands out as a Schematron schema. Then we have a query binding attribute. Query binding, and I'm going to tell you more about that later, tells the Schematron processor what query language to use. And if you set it to XSLT3, you get the best of the best, because you get XPath 3.1 expressions, and you can incorporate XSLT functions, XSLT3 functions, and XSLT3 keys. If you happen to have another processor, an older processor, or maybe a bespoke processor, this might not work, because XSLT3 is, of course, relatively new. It's around for years, but for some people it's still new. You could try XSLT2, or you could try XPath, or some other values. But in Oxygen, at least, this will work. And then we have a pattern. Schematron schemas, as I will tell you later, are built up of patterns, and this is an empty pattern. And there must at least be one pattern in a Schematron file, otherwise it isn't valid. So this is an empty schema. So let's talk a bit more about patterns and rules. Schematron schemas are built up of patterns. And every pattern in your Schematron schema is applied to every node in your document, which means not only the elements, but also the attributes and the commands and the processing instructions, every node in the XDM tree in your document. every pattern. A pattern consists of rules. And rules have a context attribute that tells the rule where it applies to. And a context attribute, for those who know XSLT, who knows XSLT? Right. And it's an XSLT match pattern. So it tells it what element, attribute, whatever thing it should apply to. And only the first rule in a pattern that matches will get executed. We'll get to what a rule consists of later in the next slide. But only the first rule will execute. So if you have a wooden a thing made of wood, then the first rule will execute and the second rule not. And if it's no, well, you get the idea. Only the first rule executes. Inside a rule are assertions and reports. The first thing that happens when a rule fires is that the node it fired upon will become the context item, right? Like in XSLT, you have a context item, which you can address with the dot operator. So that will become the context item. And then a rule consists of 0 or more either assertions with a test expression on it, and an assertion will fire when the test expression is true. Sorry, false. Sorry, when the test expression is false, when the assert fails, and a report will fire when the test expression is true. So that's the whole idea. Yeah.
So there's no sense of patterns.
No, there's no. That's correct. Yeah, thank you, John. No, there's no. It's the first rule in document order that fires. Where was it? All right. All asserts and reports in a rule will get tested as when a rule fires. So it's not only the first one, but all of them. And there it comes. The contents of the assert or report element will be issued as the message. So you write your message, the error message, the report message there yourself. So here's a small example. We have a thing with a code and a price, and we have a rule that matches on the thing. And we assert that the code starts with a T. And if not, we issue the message codes must start with a T. Maybe you could also write the same rule in XML schema, for instance, especially in the 1.1 version, but then you get a very, very unfriendly error message. This you can dress up yourself as good or as bad as you like it. And I also wrote a report there, which says if the price is bigger than 100, then we have a high price thing found. Okay, fine. Maybe you want to know that. Maybe the user should know that, or whatever. Asserts are much more common than reports. So most schemas I've seen and I've written are just about asserts. But it's still good to know that the report feature is there.
Question.
Yeah.
So an assert works if the thing is true and the report is true.
Another way around. An assert fires when the test expression is false. Yeah. Right? So when it asserts something, and when it's false, the assert fails, and it's an error. It's a validation error. Right. Thanks. So this is the whole idea. You have patterns. Patterns contain rules. Rules contain asserts and reports. Very basic. Okay. So here's the time for the first hands-on. What I want you to do is to go to the exercises, exercise 0201 folder, read the instructions.pdf, where are we? Yeah. And in this case, I want you to validate a document so that this is a very simple document. And I want you to assert that the identifier is exactly 9 characters long, and report all identifiers that start with the character X because it's being special. And what you should do then is open template, this one, which is an empty Schematron schema, which is automatically connected to input.xml. Dus if you write your schema here and then go back to input.xml, validate it, then the validation should happen automatically.
Loudly, or should I have it? Oh, here. Where do we have to?
Oh, oh, oh.
I couldn't reach. You stated that the assertions in document order are an implicit priority just by document order.
The standard says nothing about that, but they usually do.
Because I've corrupted the input data in order to test that, and I found that I could trigger both reports under one rule.
That's correct. If a rule fires, all asserts and reports will get executed.
But that's in conflict with the statement that only the first in document order.
No, only the first rule in document order.
Oh, forgive me.
And
Okay.
inside the rule,
Oh,
everything will get
everything's fine.
executed.
It's just the rule.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. And it's interesting that you say, because the standard, the Schematron standard says nothing about in which order things should be done. But of course, usually things are executed in document order. All right. Does anybody need more time? Otherwise, I would like to proceed. Did anybody have a result? Oh, I see no. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Let's have a look at the what it should be, what it can be, which is this. So we trigger on the ID element, and we assert that its string length is bigger than 9, or is equals to 9, and if not, we say it must be 9 characters long. And we report when it starts with an X that we have a special identifier. This is the code that does the trick. That's somewhere what you did, Peter.
I'm having a problem with the association, the transformation scenarios. Which one should I choose? So I have the input file open, and then I run a
Validate. Yeah, then you just validate.
Validate. All right.
Just press the validate button. The red check mark. Because the association is in the project file already.
Well, I'm seeing your local paths, disk paths. So, but maybe that's something I corrupted.
I don't know. Anybody else having this problem? No? Sorry, Peter. All right, so with that, let's continue with the next part. So we have patterns, rules, asserts, and reports, which is actually the basic of the language. And of course, the power is in that you can write your own XPath expressions, and that can be very complicated if you want to. So, and you can write your own messages, which can be very user-friendly if you want to. So that's really the basic power of Schematron. But there's more, of course. So let's get back to this rule processing thing, because somebody predicted me who actually David Maus, who is the author of the Xatapult Schematron processor, which Oxygen isn't using, by the way. But he also gives Schematron courses, and he says this is always a problem thing. So I added an exercise to make sure that it will land properly. Let's revisit this rule processing thing for a moment. Let's assume we have an XML document with books and magazines in it. We have book elements and we have magazine elements. And we have specific rules both for books. We have specific rules for books and magazines, and we have rules that apply to both of them, right? So then the question is, will this work? Will this be okay to get that effect? Who dares to say something about it? Ken?
The third rule won't fire if it's already fired earlier.
Exactly. Exactly. The third rule will not fire because if you have a book or a magazine, the rules above it have already fired, and then the third rule will never fire if you have only books and magazines. So this will not work. The question is, how can we make it that it does work, right? So I want you to think about it, to ponder about it at the moment. And that's another exercise in 0202. Let me show you. Here's the input with books and magazines. And here is the schema I just put on the slide. So would you try to change this schema that the generic, the last rule also actually gets executed? So change this schema into something that actually works, that actually does the trick. And the key to the solution is to think about what patterns do. Because patterns get executed for all nodes in the document. Is there anybody who has thought of a solution for this? Manuel?
Yeah,
Two patterns, yeah, that's the trick. You have to isolate this last rule into a pattern of its own, and then it will get executed. So you get this. You put it in a pattern of its own, and it will get executed for every node. Yeah. I'm sorry. So you're saying change the /star into? Yes, but then the specific rules for books and magazines won't get executed. Because only the first rule will get executed, and you want both the rule for books, for magazines, and for all to get executed.
Oh, that's what I put.
Yeah.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So this is the way to do it. You create an additional pattern in which you isolate this rule for all your that apply to all elements or that should apply to all elements. All right? Yeah.
The shadow extension of SBRL later on today.
I'm not even sure what you're talking about, so I don't think so. Yeah. Maybe Mike?
Yeah.
Okay. Using SCH XSLT, I don't know how to pronounce it, so I'll just spell it out.
Yeah, Schematron, yeah.
Checksalt?
Schematron, yeah.
Checksalt, okay. If you could restore the erroneous
Yeah,
file.
this one.
Yes. Oxygen does not say anything about the third rule.
No,
Checksalt does.
that's it.
In SVRL, it has an element that isn't defined in SVRL, informing you that a shadowed rule could not fire.
Ah.
And in my day-to-day work, I've leveraged that to tell my clients that there is an internal error, not a user error, but I call it an internal error. And the users come back to me saying, I've got an internal error report, and that tells me I've got a shadowed rule.
All right.
And I wanted to bring that to the attention of developers because in case you weren't going to.
I wasn't aware of that, so it's good.
So I offer that as a diagnostic
Mm-hmm.
analyzing the SVRL so that your users can tell you when you've done something wrong.
Okay, that's a very useful thing. Xatapult does a lot of things extra above what the Schematron standard offers. So, and this is one of the things I wasn't aware of. That's good. Okay. Thank you, Ken. Right. So this is something important to keep in mind, because if your Schematron schema doesn't do what you think it does, that one of the usual reasons is this, and the other reason is namespaces. But we'll get to that. All right. So we're about to. I'm going to tell you about SVRL. So this is a nice bridge. It has Schematron has an output language called SVRL, and in Oxygen you don't see it. So, but I'm going to show you a bit of SVRL later. If you use the command line version, you will see the SVRL as the result of your Schematron processor. And it's very useful in tool chains, so you can create your own reports or check that I don't know, an assert with a certain identifier has come up and that there's some extra. Well, you can think of all kinds of scenarios that you want to actually check the result of your validation. Here is what a SVRL looks like. It's actually the basics of SVRL are a linear list of what the processor is doing. You can see it activated a pattern, it fired a rule, an assert failed, blah, blah, blah. Lots of these things. It's just a linear rule. Now, as a sideline, the Schematron SVRL connection, what actually SVRL looks like and how the Schematron processor should process it, is, you might be surprised, not specified in the standard. So that it looks like this is because the very first Schematron processor outputs something like this. It's not defined. There are no production rules. So which tells you that if a pattern fires, you should output a active pattern element. Nothing like that. Besides that, SVRL is the schema for SVRL, which isn't the standard, is a bad schema because it has a lot of wrong types and etc. So, but we brought that to the attention of the ISO, which is the keeper of the standard, and they've now opened up again the standardization process of Schematron. So I think that's a good thing, because a good standard will make sure that if you have more processors, that your outputs are compatible, etc., etc. But SVRL is an underdefined thing in the Schematron standard. So you're a bit up to your own, and if you're using different processors, you should be lucky that the output is the same. But usually you use only one, so the problem will be small. But anyway.
Erik?
Yeah.
One question from Gary Kapinski
Yeah.
via the email. Is the ISO Schematron standard normative for SVRL?
No.
Answer.
It's
no.
not, sorry, the Schematron standard is not normative for SVRL, no. And also Schematron processors are not, do not have to create SVRL at all. I mean, that's an optional thing. So. All right, so let's make our messages that we output a bit more meaningful. And we can do that by inserting values from, for instance, the document we're validating into our messages. For instance, like I do here, we have a test on some code, and we test whether it's equal to 4, and the message is a code must be, yeah, okay, a code must be 4 characters long. But it would of course be nice if the original code, which was not 4 characters long, would also be shown in the message, and you want to insert it in the message, which makes your messages better. So we can do this, add a value element in our message that gets the value of whatever XPath expression you put in the select attribute, and inserts this in your message. So that's actually all there is to the value of element. It looks a bit like the XSL value of element, right? So I want you to go along. This is 03. So what I want you to do is we have an input file, and what I want you to do is, like the instructions say, make the messages better. If you look in the instructions, there are also some additional changes. If this is too easy for you. How are things going? I don't see any raised hands. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. All right. Has anybody managed the additional changes, or is busy with the additional changes? In the exercises. All right. For the sake of time, I would like to show you what it should look like. Well, the first thing was, of course, the question is, how to output the code attributes somewhere in your message. I mean, that's easy. You can just put the value of with the code attribute into your validation message, and then it gets nicely, your message gets nicely formatted with the code attribute. But then I also ask you, or in the additional changes, which have nothing to do with value of anyway, but to enhance the schema that books have less than 200 pages and magazines have less than 6 articles. And I wanted to make these messages, the message for these rules should only appear for books and magazines that are invalid and have that they don't fire on already invalid books and magazines. So you must make sure you must think a little bit about the order of which things are executed. And the way, at least the way I thought about how to do that is this. Is I put all the, I mean, this is for instance a check on a page count attribute. And what happens here is that this rule does not fire when there is no page count attribute, because that rule, that the thing that it has a page count attribute, we checked here, and this rule does not fire if it does not have a page count attribute at all. So then this thing is not checked, which is a good thing. So we get a message that there is no page count attribute, and then this one does not fire because it has no page count attribute. If it does have a page count attribute, it does fire, and it will check whether it's less than 200. Does that make sense? Any questions? Okay. We're about 45 minutes into the tutorial. I've been asked to ask you whether you want to break now, or shall we just continue until 12 to lunch? Continue? Good. All right. So that's what the value of, which is very valuable in making your messages better. All right. Schematron also has variables, and variables you create with the let element. So it's easy, you say let name is variable name and value is some XPath expression that puts a value into that variable. That's actually all there is to it. You can put these let statements as children of the schema, of the pattern, and of the rule. For a schema and a pattern, the context item is the document node. So because there's nothing fired upon yet, right? So this is a good place to put variables that are global, things you get from somewhere in a document, or just create variables for magic values. In a rule, you can get values from, you have a context item, that's actually where the rule fired upon. You reference a variable with a dollar prefix, like XSLT. I mean, that's for XSLT programmers, that will not be a surprise. And you can use them anywhere in your XPath expressions. So that actually all there is about variables. And they're useful because, of course, you can do complex computations only once if you need the value twice, things like that. You can create variables for magic values, which documents your schema, things like that. So, sorry again, back to work. 0204. We have articles, and I want, and what I would like to, yeah, and the articles have an attribute here called dep code, department code, and all codes must start with the department code. What I want you to do is put this department, the value of this attribute, in a variable, and then use it in the XPath expressions, in the XPath expression in the schema, in this schema. All right, everybody inserted the variable? And if not, it's easy. Let me show you. So here is including the extras I asked you in the instructions. So the first thing is we create a variable department code on the highest level. We read the value of the department code attribute, and we use that in the asserts. And what I also do is in the rule create a variable for the article code because we use it. Because we use this value twice, so we don't have to get it twice from the document. It's a very minor optimization, but it might make your code more readable. Well, the schema needs an XML. This XML. Is it? That's a mistake. Sorry, remove this XMLNS thing in the input file. Sorry, mistake. My mistake. Thanks for spotting. Well, this inventory list is now in a namespace and it should not validate at all. Actually. So remove this attribute, please. It's one of mine. So this is variables. Another interesting question for the more XPath aware people here: what actually is the data type of the variable you're creating? What do you think? For instance, in the first case. Come on. The department code variable, what data type does it have? Yeah, well, it actually is a attribute node, but because that is automatically atomized into a string on these kinds of comparisons, you will not notice. There are, of course, situations that you will notice and you will get strange errors. So Schematron does not yet, I hope, have an attribute that actually sets the data type of a variable. There's no S, like in XSLT you have an S attribute that you could set the data type of a variable. Schematron does not have that yet, but it's one of the enhancement proposals we hope to get into the new version of the standard. Because it's quite important if your schemas get a little bit more complicated. Okay. Namespaces. We just had a problem with a namespace that I forgot to remove from my exercise input. So sorry for that. But namespaces are actually an interesting thing in Schematron, because usually, let's assume you need the HTML namespace to check something in your document. The normal way of declaring it with an XLMS pseudo attribute or namespace declaration does not work. If you do it, I mean, you can put it in your document, that's fine, but it will not have the effect you intend, because the namespace declaration will not be valid in your XPath expressions. It will not be there, and it's very frustrating because if you did this, does it work? No, it doesn't. The last line, if you did that and then you run your Schematron scheme, and it says you didn't declare the XH prefix, but I did. It's on the root element, but the error message stays the same. So Schematron has a special way of declaring namespaces, and you have, if you need namespaces in your XPath expressions, you need to use the NS element namespace, of course, and you give it a URI, URI, and you give it a prefix, right? So every namespace prefix you want to use, you need to put an NS element at the top of your schema. So let's try this this one. Let me close everything. We have an input, which is in the docbook namespace. And what I want you to do here is to, as the instructions say, I want you to check whether there are at least 3 paragraphs. And here there are 2, so this is invalid. And the title must not be longer than 45 characters. And this one is longer than 45 characters. So which is also invalid. So please write a schema that tests this. And don't forget the docbook namespace. All right, let's have a look at the solution then. All right, here's one of the many solutions, of course, you can have. And the thing, of course, to notice is that there is does it now work? Yeah, good. There's a namespace declaration up there, which attaches the prefix DB to the docbook namespace, since all elements in your input document are in the docbook namespace. And everywhere you want to fire or do something with your input document, you need to use the DB prefix, like you have over here, the DB sec1 thing. If you don't, it will check for elements in no namespace, which are not in your document. Also notice that I used variables here to add some magic values to to make the magic values for the various things we want to check, which is just good programming practice. Any questions so far? Yeah.
I was wondering this query binding at the very top. It's a bit off topic, but are there different values you could put there?
I'll get back to that.
Okay, sorry.
Yeah, at the end of the document, at the end of the presentation, I'll get back to that.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. But it's a good question.
Someone else want to ask a question?
Someone else? Okay.
Okay.
All right. So actually, we're there for basic Schematron. This is what you need to know for basic Schematron. If you master these few things, then you can write useful, meaningful, interesting Schematron schemas. It's not very much, right? So let's get over it one more time. We have a schema root element with a namespace. And within that, we have patterns, we have rules, and rules have assertions and reports. Assert and report elements. You can, the contents of your assert and report elements are the messages that are actually thrown, the processor throws at you, processor throws at the user. You can enhance these messages using a value of by inserting computed values or stuff from your document, or even stuff from another document. If you have a doc, use the XPath doc function, you can do everything you can do in XPath expression, you can do there. You create variables using the let element, and you create namespaces using, you declare namespaces. Don't forget that you have to use the NS element for that and not use the usual XMLNS colon something notation that you're used to when you write a lot of XML. So actually, that's basic Schematron. It's easy, isn't it? Right, it's one chapter in the book. So I would like to get a little bit further on some more interesting things. Well, this was already interesting, of course, but there are more interesting things coming up. Right.
Erik, before you proceed, there's one question from Jochen Zwartje
Yeah.
to everyone. Do I have to use the special namespace element for namespaces? Or can I use the official prefixes of the containing XML documents?
If I understand the question right, when do you use the NS element and when do you use the containing
Yes.
namespaces? For all namespaces used in your XPath expressions, you must use the NS element. You must declare your namespace using the NS element. You can still put them on the as a namespace attribute or a namespace declaration on your root element, but it won't work.
But is there a way to default the namespace?
Sorry, again?
Is there something like a default namespace? Is it possible?
No. Which means because of this mechanism, Schematron does not have a default namespace.
Okay.
No.
Thanks.
Yeah. Oh, you're...
I have just one remark. I noticed that in Siegel,
Yeah.
yeah, that a report is shown as invalid in the command line output, which is not necessarily true, right? Because you just want to report something.
How is it shown as invalid?
There's square bracket invalid square bracket at the very beginning when I'm doing verbose output. This is
Okay.
the way I'm looking at it.
Well,
at the moment.
that's a Schematron interpretation of the standard.
Okay.
So
I should report this.
you should
maybe.
report it to David. Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. Okay. Any more questions before we continue?
There's a question online from Eamon.
Yeah.
But I don't understand the question, but that's
Well, we
because
can
I'm
read
an
it.
expert, of course. Is there anything XML specific in Schematron that would prevent its application to JSON documents other than query mechanism and namespaces?
Yeah.
I thought, yeah.
Yeah.
okay.
I think the question is, can we use Schematron on JSON?
Yeah, I think so.
I think if I understood it correctly.
Yeah.
I'm not aware of that happening. I don't know. There's nothing that the language does not prevent it from happening. You could that's the query binding attribute. You can use all kinds of query languages for in your schema. But there is at this moment, as far as I know, no JSON Schematron. But you never know what's out there in the world. Right? Right. More questions online here? Nope. Okay. Let's have a look at something called abstract patterns. Abstract patterns are all despite their fancy name macros. And an abstract pattern is actually something that you can use if you have patterns that repeat and repeat, but with slightly different variation. So it's a macros, and you instantiate an abstract pattern by providing values for this thing. And I'll we'll get an example in the next slide. So let's have a look at this. This actually comes from the standard. We have an HTML table, and we have which is a table TRTD HTML table, and we have a table-like structure with years, weeks, and days. I mean, it's the same kind of structure, right? And we want to write a schematron that both checks the table and that checks the calendar-like structure, and we want. But we don't want to repeat ourselves. We don't want to repeat the pattern. The thing is almost the same. So how can you do that? This is the abstract pattern that actually checks this. what you see here, these dollar things look like variables, but what they actually are macro parameters. So as soon as you instantiate the pattern, the values of these dollar thingies there will be replaced with the values you throw in when you instantiate your macro. So you have abstract pattern parameters, they start with $, which makes them not stand out from usual variables, which is, I think, a design error, but I can't help it. They will be replaced with text. They're not XPath expressions, it's textual replacement. Another thing to remember for abstract patterns is that they're not declared in any way. There's no way when you instantiate an abstract pattern that the processor can check whether you actually provided all values for all abstract macro patterns. It does not. It cannot check that. So you have to do it in documentation and have to be very careful. Also something I hope we can amend in the next version of the standard. So how do we instantiate then this pattern? By, for instance, we have the one for HTML tables, and we say a pattern, and it is a table pattern, which is the thing because it has an ID here, table pattern. And we provide parameters, we provide values for all the macro, for all the abstract pattern parameters. So in the first case, we try to check an HTML table, and we say the table element is table, the row element is tr, and the entry element is td. And for the calendar table-like structure, we provide other values for these things. Another gotcha here is that the value attribute is not an XPath expression. It's text. It's just plain string, nothing complicated about it. So this is the way you write an abstract pattern. You give it an ID, and you use $variable-like constructions for all your parameters, for all your abstract pattern parameters. And then you instantiate it with a pattern is a something attribute. And I want you to do is to create an abstract pattern here. We have an input file with creates with various things that can be in a ship or something, and wooden crates must weigh less than some value, and containers must weigh less than some value. It's in your instructions. And I want you to, I mean, you could easily do this with an XPath expression, probably. Yeah, you could. But just honor me and write an abstract pattern that checks the value, the weight of a crate, and instantiate it twice, once for wooden crates and once for containers. All right, for the sake of time, I'm going to show you the solution. No, that's not the right one. This one. All right, here's how I solved this thing. And as I say, there are more than one way to do it. What I did here is I created a pattern, an abstract pattern with an ID, and I documented which parameters it has, because if you don't and it gets complicated, you will get lost. It has two parameters. It's a type parameter and it has a max weight parameter. And remember, they're text, they're not XPath expressions. So I'll just say I have on a rule which actually triggers on the $type, what's in $type. And I then assert that the weight is less than the other parameter. So this will actually get instantiated twice, once here for crates of type wood and one here for type container. And this only works because the value parameter is text and not an XPath expression. Otherwise, you will get very strange things. Yeah. Yuri.
So the first parameter, in the assertion, the first thing is converted to XS integer or casted to XS integer, but the second one isn't, even if the value is likely also text, or is it not? Param name max height is value 30. That could be any string, right?
Sorry, this one here, this cast.
The first one is casted, but the second one isn't.
No, because the max weight is a abstract pattern parameter. It's text. So what actually happens is that this actually happens. It gets expanded, and there is just the number 30 there, or 2500 in the second instantiation.
Yeah, how is it automatically created to cast to integer?
You have to read it as text. It's not a variable. It's a macro. So this string here, this string 30, gets this $max weight gets replaced by the string 30. So then on sets x is integer weight kilogram less equal than 30, which is a valid XPath expression. No,
okay.
No, it's text.
Yeah, that's the one thing that I'm wondering about. Why is it, why you do not have to cast max weight to XS integer as well?
For example, you can put the LPs in there as well.
Yeah. No, it's a string replacement. I mean.
Okay. Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
Yeah. And I must say, I personally do not agree with the decisions the Schematron committee took on this. I mean, this is very primitive. I mean, text replacement. On the other hand, it makes it possible to do this trick here with the $type. You couldn't do it without textual replacement of actually $type parameter. No, it's not. It's text.
Yeah, the text will be the value.
It will be replaced, yeah. And then what the result will be get evaluated. Yeah, after the replacement. Yeah. It's a bit primitive, but it's useful in various circumstances if you have complex patterns that repeat with slightly different values. All right, how long do I have? 5 minutes. Oh, Peter comes in. All right. One more subject and then we have lunch, right? All right. Maybe there are situations that you do not want to have every pattern in your Schematron schema active, because in some cases you have rules that only apply to a specific situation or apply in a later stage of your input documents or whatever. So there is a mechanism in Schematron in which you can say, I only want these patterns to get active. And that mechanism is called phases. What's in the name? And you do it like this. At the top of your Schematron schema, you say what phases you have. So in this case, we say we have a phase called normal only, and we only select the pattern with the ID normal rules. And here we have, at the bottom, we have defined some pattern with the ID normal rule. So if we run a Schematron schema with the phase normal only this top pattern will be active, and the special rules and the very special rules pattern will not be active. The rules in there will not get executed. And we have normal and special, and then we say, okay, we have 2 active patterns. And actually you would probably might also expect a phase all, but you don't need to define that because that's the default. So you don't need to define a phase for that. You could, but you don't need to. So you create, the trick is put an ID on your pattern and reference it with phase active elements. Easy. Then the question is, of course, how can you select a phase? Because if you run your Schematron processor, it should know which phase we are on. The answer to that, according to the standard, is implementation defines. So that's very nice. In practice, there are a few ways you can do it. The first thing is well, that's not really. You can put a default phase attribute on your root element. That is part of the standard, and that's just what it says. It's a default phase. If it runs and you don't specify anything else, that's the phase it's going to run. In Oxygen will automatically recognize that you have phases in your Schematron schema and will pop up a dialog for you. It's nice. And on the command line, for the people that use Schematron on the command line, it's -p name of your identifier of your phase. But again, this is all implementation defined. So if you use not a processor, it will probably be some other mechanism. But these are the things you can do. So, without further ado, I would like you to do exercise 0302, which is about this is an input document. The idea behind this is that you usually write a document with, you create a structure first. So you create a title, and then you create a content, and then after that you do all these things like creating footnotes. So you want phases. You want, in the first phase, you want only to check your title. In another phase, you want to check the title and the paragraphs. There are rules for the paragraphs. And if you want it all, you check the title, the paragraphs, and the footnotes. And so you write patterns for all these 3 things, and you write phases that check all this. But I also see on my watch that it's 2 minutes before 12. And at 12, it's the lunch. So what I suggest is that we go to lunch now, and you ponder on this question a little. And if you want to, you have some time left and you don't want to take a walk, you could try the exercise, and I'll explain the answer after the lunch. And we'll continue after lunch with more subjects. Thank you.